There's something you need to understand about Australians who grew up in the 1950s and 1960s. They weren't just tough. They were forged in circumstances that created a level of resilience we'll probably never see again. Not because they were special or superior, but because the world they grew up in demanded it. Survival wasn't a metaphor, comfort wasn't a given, and weakness simply wasn't an option. Today, we're looking at why Australians in the 1950s and 1960s became the toughest generation in history. Not through rose-tinted nostalgia, but through the real conditions that shaped them into the people they became. Let's understand what made them unbreakable. Number 1. They built everything from nothing with their own hands. And here's the ultimate reason this generation became so tough. They built their lives from scratch, with their own hands, with no shortcuts. They didn't inherit wealth, they didn't have easy credit, they didn't have technology to make things easier. They built their own houses, fixed their own cars, grew their own food, made their own entertainment. Every comfort, every possession, every step forward was the result of physical labor and determination. They saved for years to buy a block of land, then spent weekends and evenings building a house on it. They repaired everything because buying new wasn't an option. They learned skills out of necessity, carpentry, plumbing, mechanics, sewing, because paying someone else was too expensive. That constant physical engagement with the material world, that requirement to be capable and self-sufficient, created a toughness that came from knowing you could handle anything because you'd already built everything you had from nothing. When you've literally built your own house with your own hands, raised your own food, fixed your own machinery, you develop a confidence and capability that no amount of education or wealth can replicate. Number 2, emotional vulnerability was punished, not supported. If there's one thing that defined emotional development in the 1950s and 60s, it was this. Feelings were private, vulnerability was weakness, and expressing emotion was discouraged. Boys especially were taught to suppress everything except anger. Crying meant you were weak. Talking about your problems meant you were soft. Asking for help meant you couldn't handle life. The phrase toughen up wasn't casual advice. It was the fundamental philosophy of child rearing. Girls had slightly more room for emotion, but even they were expected to be strong, capable, and uncomplaining. That created adults who could endure incredible emotional pain without showing it, who could face tragedy without falling apart, who had an internal strength that came from years of suppressing vulnerability. Now, we understand that this caused real psychological damage, that it created generations of people who couldn't express love or process trauma. But it also created a toughness, an ability to function under emotional duress that's become increasingly rare. They were tough because they had to be, because showing weakness meant isolation, judgment, and rejection. Number 3, they faced real physical danger regularly. Childhood in the 1950s and 60s was genuinely dangerous. Kids climbed trees without safety equipment, swam in rivers and oceans without lifeguards, played with tools and machinery, and explored the bush without adult supervision. Accidents happened constantly, broken bones, near drownings, cuts that probably needed stitches but were just bandaged at home. There were no safety standards, no risk assessments, no bubble-wrapped playgrounds. You learned to assess danger yourself, to take calculated risks, to understand your own limits through trial and error. That exposure to real physical risk created situational awareness, quick decision-making, and the understanding that the world was dangerous and it was your job to navigate it safely. The coddling, the constant supervision, the elimination of all risk from childhood, none of that existed. You learned toughness by surviving situations that today would be considered criminally negligent. And the ones who made it through, which was most of them, became incredibly self-reliant and physically capable. Number 4, medical care was limited and pain was endured. Healthcare in the 1950s and 60s was nothing like today. There was no Medicare. Doctor visits cost money most families didn't have, and you only went if something was seriously wrong. Minor injuries, chronic pain, dental problems, you lived with them, kids broke bones and were told to walk it off. Toothaches were endured until the pain became unbearable, and then the tooth was pulled, not fixed. There were no painkillers beyond aspirin, no advanced treatments, no MRIs or specialists. You learned to tolerate pain, to function through it, to accept it as part of life. That taught a kind of physical toughness that's rare now. When you can't rely on medical intervention for every ache and pain, you develop a higher pain threshold and a greater tolerance for discomfort. Do you remember your grandparents dismissing injuries that would send people to emergency rooms today? Saying, "It's nothing," or "I've had worse"? That wasn't bravado. It was the reality of growing up in a time when you simply had to be tougher than the pain. Number 5, living conditions were harsh and uncomfortable. The homes that shaped the 1950s and 60s generation were nothing like today's comfortable, climate-controlled spaces. Most houses had no insulation, no heating beyond a single fireplace or bar heater, and no cooling except opening windows and hoping for a breeze. You froze in winter and sweltered in summer, and you just dealt with it. Many families still had outdoor toilets well into the 60s, the dunny down the back, no heating, spiders everywhere, freezing in winter and stinking in summer. Baths were taken once or twice a week in a tin tub filled with water heated on the stove, and siblings shared the same water. Bedrooms were shared, privacy was minimal, and personal space was a luxury most kids never experienced. You learned to sleep through cold, through heat, through discomfort. You learned that life wasn't about being comfortable, it was about enduring. That daily physical discomfort, that constant exposure to the elements and to harsh conditions, built a tolerance for hardship that became second nature. When you've grown up sleeping in a freezing room with frost on the inside of the windows, or sweating through summer nights with nothing but a wet towel, you develop a toughness that can't be taught. Number 6, work was physically brutal from a young age. Kids in the 1950s and 60s started working young, and the work was hard. By 12 or 13, boys were doing paper rounds before school, laboring on farms, helping in family businesses, or doing whatever work they could find. Girls were expected to help with housework, childcare, and often worked in shops or offices as soon as they could. The work wasn't light or easy, it was physically demanding, often dangerous, and it taught you early that life required effort and pain. By the time you were an adult, you'd already done a decade of hard labor. You'd learned that comfort was earned, that nothing was given, and that if you wanted anything, you worked for it. That early exposure to physical hardship built bodies that were stronger and minds that were tougher. You learned to push through tiredness, to work through minor injuries, to show up even when you didn't want to. The concept of a gap year, of finding yourself, of needing time to figure out what you wanted, none of that existed. You worked from childhood onward, and that work made you tough. Number 7, they had zero safety nets or soft landings. If you failed in the 1950s or 60s, there was no one to catch you. No welfare safety net worth mentioning, no unemployment benefits that would sustain you, no family money to fall back on for most people. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. If you couldn't find a job, that was your problem. If you made bad decisions, you lived with the consequences permanently. That created a level of personal responsibility and fear of failure that drove people to push through anything. You couldn't afford to give up, couldn't afford to be precious about what work you'd do, couldn't afford to wait for the perfect opportunity. You took what was available and you made it work. That absence of safety nets meant people developed an internal toughness, a refusal to quit, because quitting meant genuine hardship. There was no reset button, no do-over, no soft landing. You either made it or you didn't, and that reality forged a generation that simply wouldn't allow themselves to fail. Number 8. Physical punishment was normal and frequent. Kids in the 1950s and 60s grew up with corporal punishment as a daily reality. At school, at home, even from neighbors, physical discipline was accepted, expected, and widespread. You got the strap for forgetting homework, the cane for talking back, a clip around the ear for being cheeky. And when you got home, if your parents found out, you got it again. There was no discussion, no negotiation, no second chances. The message was brutally simple. Step out of line and there are immediate, painful consequences. Now, we can debate whether this was right or wrong, whether it was abuse or discipline. But here's what it did. It created kids who understood cause and effect, who knew that actions had consequences, and who learned to control their behavior out of sheer self-preservation. Do you remember the fear of getting the strap and how it made you think twice before doing something stupid? That constant threat of physical punishment created a generation that was disciplined, controlled, and tough enough to take pain without breaking. Number 9. They grew up in the shadow of war and depression. The adults raising children in the 1950s and 60s had lived through the Great Depression and World War II. That meant kids grew up in households where trauma was the background noise, where parents had seen the worst humanity could offer, and where the message was clear. Life is hard, and you'd better be harder. There was no therapy, no processing of feelings, no acknowledgement that maybe those experiences had left scars. Parents taught their kids what they knew: don't complain, don't expect help, and don't show weakness. The psychology of scarcity and survival was passed down like DNA. You didn't waste food because your parents remembered genuine hunger. You didn't waste money because they'd lived through years of having none. You learned early that the world was an unforgiving place, and if you wanted to survive, you needed to be tough. That inheritance of hardship, that direct transmission of depression and wartime mentality, created a generation that approached life with a hardness that seems almost foreign today. So there you have it, why Australians in the 1950s and 1960s became the toughest generation in history. They were shaped by post-war scarcity, by physical discipline, by the absence of safety nets, by brutal work from childhood, by harsh living conditions, by limited health care, by real danger, by emotional suppression, and by the necessity of building everything themselves. Was this a good way to grow up? In many ways, no. It created trauma, it suppressed emotion, it normalized violence, and it left scars that lasted lifetimes. But it also created a toughness, a resilience, a determination that's almost impossible to find now. They could endure anything, survive anything, build anything. They asked for nothing, expected nothing, and took responsibility for everything. We live easier lives today, safer lives, more comfortable lives. And that's progress. But we've lost something too, that raw, uncompromising toughness that came from necessity. That generation is fading now, and when they're gone, we'll have lost the last people who truly understood what it meant to be that tough, not by choice, but by survival. What's the toughest thing your parents or grandparents from that era endured, and how did it shape how they lived their lives? This was Retro Australia, where the past is still alive.